Very much to the CIIS for helping make today possible, and thank you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we have here. I'm just going to put some ideas on the table, some thoughts on sports, capitalism, and activism as well, and then I look forward to that conversation. I want to start off with President Barack Obama when he took office in 2009. Along with the Pentagon, they unleashed this covert cyber sabotage attack on Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities. And thanks to a programming error, the operation's cyber worms slithered out errantly, and we learned about it, slithered all around the internet for us to see. They called it Stuxnet. The computer security gurus did. This cyber weapon was Stuxnet. But what code name did the Pentagon use? They actually used Operation Olympic Games. And when I thought about it later, it makes sense. After all, first, it was orchestrated covertly by political elites behind closed doors. Second, it wreaked havoc on the local host. And third, it cost a whole lot in terms of political and actual capital. So in a nutshell, I think that describes the state of sports mega events like the Olympics and World Cup today, largely clandestine, elite-driven processes with significant impacts on the host city. And what I'll focus on quite a bit today is how this huge price tag that comes with hosting things like the Olympics and World Cup is largely borne by taxpayers in the host city and country. Now you might be saying to yourself, hey, mega events like the Olympics have their upsides, and I agree. There are some things to appreciate about it. For instance, women are featured more in the Olympics. You see them more on TV than you do at other times with other sports during the regular portions of the year. So that's definitely a positive. And they're popular. A lot of people like them. A lot of people watch them, and they can bring people together. There's this sort of intangible feel-good factor that we can't deny. Now, I imagine some of you might like to deny it, because I'll bet there's some people in the room that don't like sports, okay? And I understand that. I hope you'll hear me out nevertheless, because even if you're not a big fan of sports, what I'm going to try to argue today is that there's a little bit of strategic value in embracing sports as part of your political project. If we bring sports analysis into our activist orbit, it allows us to discuss a whole lot of issues that we all care about, and in ways that would be difficult perhaps to get at if we just came straight at them. And allows us to talk to different groups of people as well. Now, recent events swirling around San Francisco 49ers former quarterback Colin Kaepernick help illuminate the power of capitalism and its ability to co-opt and domesticate opposition to transubstantiate criticism into a host of new marketable products. Now, I happen to be a huge fan of what Colin Kaepernick has done in terms of taking a knee to make a stand for justice, but that doesn't mean that we can't also think about it critically as well. And so I'd like to do that a little bit later, extending some of the work that you all have done. You can see here from a handout, maybe it's available back there, that brought this issue and tried to see it in the bigger context. It's in that spirit that I'm going to try to do that later, and I will return to Colin Kaepernick. So today what I would like to do is to first discuss the little bit of the history of the Olympic Games and show how it's eminently political, and it's actually created these various footholds for activist groups to gain leverage and talk to people about important issues. Second, I'll talk about the negative trends that often animate activists, and they are basically ingrained in hosting the Olympics in the 21st century. And along the way, I'm going to talk about how this fits with capitalism, and more specifically what I tend to call celebration capitalism. I guess Kyle did already mention that I used to spend a lot of my time playing soccer. There's a picture of me in the middle there. This was in France in 1990, a little 19-year-old kid playing for the U.S. Olympic soccer team. And I would just say a totally clueless kid, by the way. I had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. So I had no idea that NBC was cashing in big time on the Olympic Games, for example. I had no idea about the corporate sponsors that were milking the Olympics with both hands. So I'm quite sympathetic when athletes are not speaking out on these issues, and I'm especially impressed when athletes do speak out, because there are a lot of impediments to getting to the point where Colin Kaepernick is today. So the Olympics have not always been the sort of jaunty colossus that they are today. They were actually the brainchild of this guy, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, an aristocrat from France with a sweet mustache, I might add. And he was really bumming because France had just gotten crushed in the Franco-Prussian War, and he was trying to figure out how to toughen up the men for war. He was convinced that the reason why France lost so badly was because men were becoming wimps in French society. And so what he decided to do was he decided he shall burnish a flabby and cramped youth, its body and its character by sport. This is in the 1890s where he's talking here. My point in mentioning this is that from the outset, there's an embedded tension in the Olympics. On one hand, it's supposed to be this celebration of sport. On the other hand, from the beginning, it's very explicitly preparation for young men to do better, if you will, in war. Now, the Baron was a man of many talents. He was a poet. He was an award-winning poet at the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm for his poem Ode to Sport, which I won't inflict on you today, but if you want to see it, you can look online. So although he was a man of many talents, penning feminist theory was not among them. He wrote, woman's glory rightfully came through the number and quality of children she produced, and that where sports were concerned, her greatest accomplishment was to encourage her sons to excel rather than to seek records for herself. Again, the larger point is that women were pretty much excluded from the early days of the Olympic Games, a point I'll return to in a second. But he had more to say. He argued for the solemn and periodic exaltation of male athleticism with the applause of women as a reward. So the guy had some issues. They didn't stop there. There was his thoughts on colonialism as well. He actually argued that Africa should be allowed to send participants to the Olympics, but that was in order to offset their individual laziness and 1,000 jealousies of the white man. He also mentioned this in his writings: the colonies are like children. It is relatively easy to make them, but it is difficult to provide them with a good education. The Baron, along with a lot of other aristocrats throughout Europe, created this thing called the International Olympic Committee. And it had an abundance of counts and princes and barons like himself, something that actually has stayed with the International Olympic Committee all the way through today. Just last week, the International Olympic Committee elected a royal prince to their ranks. They already have the Princess of Liechtenstein. They have a number of people like the Emir of Qatar among them, a Saudi prince. They have an abundance, a predominance, you might say, of royalty, and they have from the beginning, and this is something that's come through time. They did start to allow women to be co-opted, as what they call, as a member of the International Olympic Committee. Women were allowed in 1981. So this is not a quick-moving body here. The Reagan era, for goodness sakes, is when women started to participate. Another point I just want to get straight out of the gates is that there has been activism in the context of the Olympics. For example, this gentleman, Peter O'Connor, was an Irish track athlete who at the 1906 Olympics was forced to participate for Great Britain because at the time Ireland was being run by Westminster. He was not happy about this. He was very pro-Ireland, anti-Great Britain, and when he won a silver medal in one of the events, the long jump, the flag, the Union Jack, went up the flagpole, and he ran over to the flagpole. He shimmied up it, he yanked down the Union Jack, and he held up an Erin go Bragh flag, Ireland forever, while his two Irish buddies stood at the bottom of the flagpole and fended off the Greek police that might like to try to stop him. I tracked down his grandson, and they had me over for tea and cakes outside of Dublin, and I got to see all of his papers. He was a meticulous note taker, and he took all sorts of critical notes about the media coverage of him at the time too. So if you want to talk to me about that later, I'd be happy to. But besides him, I mean, conservatism has really ruled the Olympic roost for a long time. The guy in the middle there is a tycoon in real estate from Chicago named Avery Brundage. Avery Brundage was known by African-American athletes in the United States in the 1960s as Slavery Avery for his racist policies. He was also outspokenly anti-Semitic. I love that picture. These guys are all on the International Olympic Committee. They look like they're plotting to take over the world. You have here, Avery Brundage was continuing some of the traditions of Coubertin, but he also brought this notion in that he shared with Coubertin, where politics and sports, politics and the Olympics in this case, were meant to stay totally separate. The quote you see on the screen, he said this multiple times. Every chance pretty much he was handed a microphone, he'd say some version of that. As I say, he continued with some of the thinking that I put forth before from Coubertin, and he ran the organization from 52 to 72. So athletes did not sit silently in all these biases when they were thrown in their face. When the Olympics began, there was an incredible class bias enmeshed in who was allowed to participate. Basically, you were considered a professional if you got paid for work in the very early days of the Olympics. So if you were a bricklayer, a grape picker, you would be considered a professional and you would not be allowed to participate in the Olympics. Now you can imagine, who did this open the field for? Aristocrats, like the Baron, who cashed in and got that medal, as I mentioned, in poetry. That changed quickly, in large part because of European football and English football, to be more specific. But they also made women wonder what the hell is going on, and they actually created their own Olympics. This is Alice Milliat, who is a French athlete and activist who founded an International Women's Sports Federation in 21. They held 4 of these women's Olympics as alternatives to the Olympics, where women were obviously featured and allowed to do all these sports that they were considered to be too weak to play by the International Olympic Committee. So they had 4 of these events. They had an inside-outside recipe for social change. And eventually, Milliat and company were sort of folded back into the Olympics, and the number of women's sports in the Olympics started to rise. Not quite as quickly as you might think. It's been a slow go over the years. We're finally almost reaching 50-50 nowadays, but we're still not even quite there. There was also the Workers' Olympics. There were 4 of these humongous events, hundreds of thousands of people that felt like they were boxed out of the sort of bourgeois Olympics, as they call them at the time. And so they created a number of different events, and they carried out also 3 of them. There was one that was scheduled for Barcelona, which was unfortunately cut short for the perils in 36 that were happening at that time. You can see the poster for the popular Olympics that was planned for there. There was an Olympics in 1936 that many of you probably know about, and that is the one that happened in Berlin. Adolf Hitler actually wasn't a humongous fan of sports. He doesn't mention him much in Mein Kampf, although he was a fan of boxing. He talked a little bit about that. But he was convinced by his propaganda minister, Goebbels, that he should host the Olympics. This was going to be a really great chance to propagandize to the world, and so Hitler ended up getting on board. They started a couple traditions at these Olympics that have stayed all the way through today, including the Olympic torch run, where you have the torch and you hand it to somebody, you run it around the country to sort of drum up support for the Olympics. They did that for a little while across the entire globe, but what happened was protests came and met the Olympic torch as it went around, and so now they just do it inside of the country as it was originally planned by Hitler and company. You'll probably heard about Jesse Owens, who did so well at those 1936 Berlin Olympics, only to swing around later and actually ask athletes at the 1968 Olympics who were speaking out for social justice in the United States to not do what they were doing, but I'll come back around to him in a second. It was really important at that time in 36 to put a dent in the obvious white supremacist ideology that was floating through Germany and other parts of the world at the time. Of course, the Cold War was a huge battleground, a proxy battleground for having sport by other means. There's activists that have used the Olympics in really savvy ways. So there was the South African National Olympic Committee, or SANOC, which was the official Olympic Committee of South Africa, that went along with the apartheid system. So what activists in South Africa did was they created SANROC. They threw an R in there. It was the Non-Racial Olympic Committee, South Africa Non-Racial Olympic Committee. And they pressed for South Africa to be booted from the games until they changed their apartheid ways. They were actually successful. They had to flee the country to keep fighting, mind you, but they were successful, and South Africa was expelled in the 1960s and didn't return to the Olympic fold till the 1990s. So activists have used the games as a leverage point to highlight certain elements of politics for more people that might not otherwise think about them. 68 was also important. We're right on the cusp of the 50-year anniversary being celebrated right now. And this week down in San Jose, there's some events with these two guys, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who on the medal stand famously thrust their black gloved fists into the Mexico City sky. And they were part of the Olympic Project for Human Rights that had a number of demands, including getting rid of our friend Slavery Avery Brundage, as well as restoring the boxing title to Muhammad Ali, and also condemning South Africa for its apartheid policy. So a very internationalist outlook on the part of the Olympic Project for Human Rights. Now, there was a big press to boycott those 1968 Olympics. Obviously, these two didn't. Lou Alcindor, who became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, did skip those Olympics. But I suppose we should be very grateful that these two at least decided to go and participate, because we have this iconic and important moment that really shook things up. That doesn't mean it was a popular thing around the world. You've probably heard that they were castigated in the United States by big-name sportscasters. Brent Musburger, you can still see on television calling football games today, called them black-skinned stormtroopers and really attacked them in the Chicago newspaper. It wasn't just there, it was in the New York Times where they were attacked as well. They had a very tough go of it. I mean, they had a hard time getting employment when they returned to the United States, and they detail this in their autobiographies. But I think they were eventually celebrated by people like Obama and Biden here. You can see Obama emulating the fist into the air. I think this says a little bit about cultural and historical memory, and hopefully gets people to pause and think about people who are considered to be bête noirs of the time were actually on the right side of history, and it's kind of come around where they're now being celebrated. Now, in the wake of that incident in 1968, where Carlos and Smith, they were actually kicked out of the Olympic Village. They did retain their medals, but they were kicked out of the Olympic Village. And the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, didn't sit around. They wrote a rule and put it in their Olympic charter that you can see right there. I love that part where it says you can't have a demonstration or any politics or religious stuff in any Olympic sites, venues, or other areas. Seems quite vague. I should get some lawyers on that. But it's been used to sort of stifle any athlete who might be thinking about becoming an athlete activist. Of course, what we saw in 1972 with the attacks on Israeli athletes by a Palestinian group called Black September led to Olympic hosts using the Olympics like their own private ATM machines and getting all the sort of weaponry and special laws that they would otherwise not be able to get during normal political times. So you see a spike in the securitization around the Olympics after 1972. For me, unlike a lot of other Olympic historians, I believe 1976 was a key year for the Olympics. You might be looking at that going, Denver, 1976. I don't remember that. And you're right, it never happened. It was allocated to Denver, but then citizens across the political spectrum, left and right, whether they were conservatives who were concerned about fiscal issues or people who were environmentalists concerned about the mountain ranges around Denver, decided they didn't want to put any public funds into it. They rallied, they got a referendum on the ballot, and they won that referendum, and the International Olympic Committee was forced to relocate those Olympics to Innsbruck, Austria. So those games, 76 Denver, never happened. Another important pivot in 1976 was the Montreal Summer Games. In early 1970, the mayor of Montreal, who you can see there, said that the Montreal Olympics can no more have a deficit than a man can have a baby. He promised that the Olympics would be able to be staged for $125 million. $125 million. Well, guess what? That $125 million turned into $1.5 billion. They didn't pay it off for 30 years until 2006. And I might just add as a side note, in my home state of Oregon, a man had a baby. Thomas Beatty, a trans guy, had a few, in fact. So drapeau was wrong across the board. I think the larger point is that it really started this cascade of hyper-spending on the Olympic Games. And it put the Olympics on their back foot, and guys like this, Juan Antonio Samaranch, had to figure out what to do. Because after Denver saying no to the games and Montreal spending through the roof, fewer and fewer cities were keen to host. And so Samaranch, who just as a sort of historical side note, was a Franco functionary, and there's pictures in the book Power Games that Kyle mentioned, I put of him doing the fascist salute. And so anyways, he's now running the International Olympic Committee from 1981 through the end of the century. And he was tasked with trying to figure out how to raise some funds. And what he ended up doing was he turned to corporations. He saw what happened in Los Angeles, just down the road from us here, in 1984, when there were only two cities who were originally bidding on the 1984 Summer Olympics, Los Angeles and Tehran in Iran. Tehran backed out and left one choice, and it was Los Angeles. And what this did was it provided Los Angeles with more leverage than any city has ever had since for the Olympics, where they could say to the IOC, okay, if you want to host these games in our city, here are our parameters. And limiting public spending was one of them. Bringing on a ton of corporate sponsors was another one that the LA committee would really control. At first, the IOC was freaking out, like, oh my gosh, we like to have total control over our Olympics. But they really had no choice, and what you see is this sort of burgeoning of Olympic sponsorships that started in '84. Samaranch realizes this is a real moneymaker, a real stream for us, and now today this photo's from London, 2012 Olympics, where it's just become part of the Olympic fabric, having these monstrous corporate sponsors who kick in millions and millions of dollars to be part of the Olympic Games. Now, what happened in 1984 in Los Angeles has led a lot of people to say that the Olympics are a good example of neoliberalism or neoliberal capitalism. And as you know in this room, neoliberalism is often marked by deregulation, it's marked by privatization, a lot of the lingo like letting the market decide, and that sort of thing. And when you had the larger role for private sponsors, there was a little bit that made sense. But what I'm going to argue today is that calling the Olympics a neoliberal machine is actually a mistake. There are key elements of it that are not really at all neoliberal, and at least in terms of those economic tenets that are widely agreed upon that I just laid out for you. Instead, I take the approach that sports definitely play a key role in the social reproduction of capitalism. The public is sort of dragooned into the Olympics through these grand promises of jobs and so on, and we kick in all this public funding to make them happen. But it's not really about neoliberalism, it's about something I call a specific formation of capitalism called celebration capitalism. I follow the political economist Jeff Mann, who notes, quote, in reality, there is a range of actually existing capitalisms. And so what I'm going to lay out in a minute to you is that, sure, sometimes it is neoliberal capitalism, or what Naomi Klein might call disaster capitalism. But at other times, sometimes in the exact same historical moment, you see celebration capitalism, where the public kicks in tons of money. It's not deregulated. There's incredibly tight regulations and restrictions placed on the Olympic Games. But I'll get to that in a second. I just mentioned it because Los Angeles was this moment where people start saying, oh yeah, the Olympics are this neoliberal thing. Now the result of all that is, and I should say that because of the corporate sponsors, this has created a little foothold for activists. This was painted on a wall in London ahead of the 2012 Olympics. So the result of all of this is, I talked a bit about neoliberalism, is that fewer and fewer cities are keen, and whenever a city decides to put forth a bid for the Olympics, you see protests raising up to question it. And nowadays, the activist movements pretty much are everywhere. You take, this was a picture from Sion, it just got tanked by activist resistance in Switzerland that was thinking about hosting the Olympics. Innsbruck, it just had another bid squelched. No Boston Olympics was really successful at fending off having the Olympics there in 2024. So the United States Olympic Committee moved the bid to Los Angeles, and then Los Angeles was awarded the 2028 games. I can talk about later. It was complicated, but the only reason they got it was because of activism in Boston that just said no. What's going on in Los Angeles, I think, is worth our attention right now. The Democratic Socialists of America has a group within it called No Olympics LA that is spearheading the effort in Los Angeles to push off the Olympics, or at least to use the Olympics as a way of organizing people across the political spectrum, but mostly left of center, to say no and come together and fight on all these issues. You can see they've got a number of coalition partners. Those are just some of them there. And what the Olympics can do for activist movements is bring together different groups that might not normally work together, and they work together on these issues, and that can extend even beyond the Olympic moment. I definitely saw that in Vancouver. So, all right, main things that we can see here, and this is some of what the activists in Los Angeles are focusing on, these different areas like escalating costs. There's a study done by some Oxford academics that points out that every single Olympics for which there is reliable data in the modern era has cost overruns. Not quite as bad as Montreal, but in that same ballpark. Every single one of them. Vancouver was supposed to cost $1 billion. It cost $10 billion. London was supposed to cost $3.8 billion. It cost $18 billion. Sochi was supposed to cost $12 billion. In Russia, it ended up costing more than $50 billion, more than all previous Winter Olympics combined. Rio, same thing, 12 to 20 billion. Pyeongchang, which was earlier this year, was originally supposed to cost between 6 and 7. It basically doubled that to around 13. I think you get the point. The Olympics have essentially become a sort of form of trickle-up economics where the public foots the bill and well-positioned economic elites cash in, like at some of these corporations that I mentioned. Also elected officials who are well-connected in the construction industry. It's not just the cost, it's what you're left with afterwards that can extend the cost. So white elephant stadiums is a term used in sports studies that means these stadiums that are built for these specialized Olympics that the communities afterwards have very little use for. There's some examples of Pyeongchang. They built this stadium at a tune of more than $100 million. They had 4 events in it, the opening and closing ceremonies and 2 others, and this is what it looks like today, basically disposable stadiums. There's even no plan for a social use for that. They built this ski run for the Pyeongchang Olympics, decimating a 500-year-old sacred forest, and that will never be replaced in Pyeongchang. They said they're going to replant some trees, but I mean, it's not going to work quite how it was. Rio de Janeiro, I lived in Rio de Janeiro in the lead up to and then during the Summer Olympics in 2016. This is one of the venues there, left in disrepair. This was only 6 months after the Rio Summer Games. You can see a couple other shots from Rio here. This is the canoe run that now I've heard from my friends that live there basically has more alligators inhabiting it than people using it. The Torino Games of 2006, this is actually a really interesting case because this is the Olympic Village, and you can see from the sign it fell into disrepair, but it was occupied by activists and created as a safe space for refugee communities to live, this self-governed refugee community space. This may be the best use ever, I mind you, for an Olympic Village in the history of the Games, but Turin in Italy, yeah. So, is that what you asked? Yeah. Yeah. And so then there's also Athens. There's sort of famous photos, or infamous, I guess, of what's going on in Athens after the Olympics there. A third element that has raised the ire of activists and others is the sort of the forced evictions that happen and gentrification as well. This is Beijing, where 1.5 million people were displaced for the Olympic Games of 2008. And lest you think that would put off the International Olympic Committee, they've awarded the 2022 Winter Olympics to Beijing. So the Games are actually going back to Beijing shortly. This is a photograph I took at a community I worked with in Rio de Janeiro called Vila Autódromo. You can see in the background there some of the buildings that are popped up. That's where the athlete village was. This community was decimated essentially to make way for a parking lot. And that misses out on a lot of the human stories. This is a picture of a woman I came to know and work with there named Eloisa Helena Costa Berto, and she is a candomblé practitioner, Afro-Brazilian religion. Her orisha, or her goddess, if you will, was on the water there. Her house was right along this water, just a little bit to the west, or sorry, to the north where I took this photo. And so she didn't just lose her home, and that's bad enough, don't get me wrong, but she lost the place where she could carry out her candomblé practice, and she was relocated far, far away. So there's a human cost, is what I'm trying to say. I'm talking like big numbers, but let's not forget about the human cost as well. Then there's the militarization of public space. As I mentioned to you before, hosts use the games as a way of getting all these weapons, special laws that then just stay on the books. They don't return the surveillance cameras when they're done with the Olympics, put them back in the box and send them back to the corporation that produced them. This is in Vancouver. The guy in London was asked, this guy who was overseeing security for the Olympics, he asked what were the key risks to the Olympics, and he listed terrorism, protest, organized crime, and natural disasters. And I lived in London before and during those Olympics as well, and you can imagine how happy activists were to be sandwiched in between terrorism and organized crime, right? This is from the Brazil bid book, and I put a red box around where it says activist terrorist risk. They conflate activism and terrorism, which raises the point. Terrorism is real around the Olympics, and acts. It's been pointed out by people like Doku Umarov, a Chechen rebel, that the Sochi Games were a legitimate target. Okay, so what then they do is they get all these weapons, and then who does show up, even if the terrorists don't, and God willing they don't, activists do. And so the government has all these weapons at their disposal. Now, active is listed on there as too small to see, but this was the one place in the entire Brazilian bid book for the Rio Olympics where indigenous people were mentioned. This despite the fact that there's hundreds of indigenous groups across the country of Brazil, vibrant indigenous groups. Mentioned once, and it's mentioned as a threat. This could be one of the issues that could raise up dissent that you're going to have to really keep an eye out for. So militarization of the public sphere has potential dire consequences for activism. This is from London, where they actually got surface-to-air missiles and they ratcheted it to the roof of apartment complexes. I interviewed people who learned about missiles being ratcheted to their roofs by getting a little slip of paper under their door informing them of that. They were obviously not happy. They were wondering if they had become perhaps a target by having missiles on their roof, but they basically had no say in the matter. This was when I was on a protest march. A friend of mine took this photograph of surveillance where there were some missiles actually atop that structure as well. G4S, the private security firm, was supposed to provide 10,000 people to watch for bags and do security at the Olympics, but they failed to do so, and so the troops were called in, and a lot of them weren't very happy at London 2012. They had just come back from Afghanistan. They would like a break, and instead they were sent over to the Olympics. Again, my friend Paul Fussy took this photo. I mean, shoot, even the mascots for the London Olympics looked a little bit like two-legged surveillance cameras. In Rio, I took these shots. I mean, Rio had 85,000 security officials across the city, double the number in London. And same thing for Pyeongchang as well. Another element is greenwashing, saying that you want to do all these green things when in reality the follow-through is quite minimal. The Olympics have become kind of notorious for that. In the 1990s, they brought on this new idea that it was going to be one of the 3 pillars of Olympism, being ecologically minded, but the follow-through has been really lacking. They came out with nifty documents like this, but they also built a highway to connect Vancouver and Whistler during the 2010 Olympics that went right through Eagle Ridge Bluff that had a whole host of endangered species like the red-legged frog and others. London took it to a next level of greenwashing. They created a special category of sponsors called sustainability partners. And you're seeing BP. I know everybody thinks of BP when they think of sustainability, right? Not to mention EDF, huge nuclear power company as well. So, and there was no standard by which you became an Olympic sponsor of sustainability. You just gave the money, it turns out, once some people dug in there and really looked into it. I mentioned the destruction of the forest. That's hardly ecological in Pyeongchang at the Olympics, and you had activism around that as well. And last, the trend is this idea of false promises. The Olympics often talk about legacy projects as something to keep an eye out for. The legacy of the Olympics is going to be this and that, but the follow-through is often quite weak. In Rio de Janeiro, for example, it was promised that 80% of the water flowing into Guanabara Bay, which hosted a couple of the Olympic events, 80% was supposed to be filtered, so it'd be clean water. The people of Rio, who I spoke with, were thrilled about this possibility because people swim in Guanabara Bay, and so this was going to be awesome as a legacy. Well, guess what? They didn't do it, okay? I took this picture right at the beginning of the Olympic Games. You can see trash strewn all along the side. The water quality was still extremely low. It was more like 20% was filtered instead of 80%. I took a picture of this barrier that obviously wasn't doing its job really. I got inside the Olympic zone, and an Olympic athlete who's sympathetic to some of the things I've been talking about today left me tickets to watch him participate. And I took this photo because, if you're in a helicopter above, this probably looks like, oh wow, look at that green space that was created for the Rio Olympics. But on the ground, I'm not sure if you can tell, but it's just cement that's painted green. And my friend Dave Zirin and I took this photo. We were laughing about it because it's such a greenwash. It's just incredible. So in Vancouver, there's similar big promises that were given. And, this sign, incidentally, I just as a side note, the local host has to produce a number of laws that chime with Olympic dictates. And one of those was they created this sign ordinance in Vancouver, Canada, that said you could not put signs in private spaces or in public spaces that were critical of the Olympic Games. You couldn't even put a little sign in your own home or apartment that said, Olympics, I don't really like them. They would then give you notice, and they could, if you didn't take it down, come into your home within 24 hours and take it down. This sign right here was deemed to have broken the public ordinance law. There's one smiley face among the frowns, but so that was actually ripped down. It became this focal point of fight back for a little while there. But Vancouver, same thing. And this has led a lot of people to say, let's just keep capitalism out of sport. And while I can sort of see how that might be a nice thought, what I'll argue is that capitalism is definitely a huge part of sports. It's not going to be quite that easy. Capitalism is a nimble shapeshifter. It's very flexible and takes different forms in different moments. And that with the Olympics, it's celebration capitalism. So I kind of want to lay out that argument in 2 minutes really quick. You probably know Naomi Klein in her argument, Disaster Capitalism. In her excellent book, I think it's an excellent book, and where it talks about how when there's a disaster, whether it's an economic downturn or a hurricane, the neoliberal capitalists swoop in, privatize everything with a pulse, and proceed from there. Very much of a neoliberal project. What I argue is that I think she's correct, but I think that, and there's some moments, the Olympics shine a light on it. Stadium building using public funds that you know all about here in the Bay Area is another example of it. There's lots of examples where it's really not so much that privatization going on, but it's really kind of making the public a central funder of these things and overseeing them all the way through as well. So I kind of have this little chart that I created for you where you can see that they both come out of state of exceptions. Hers is a disaster. What I'm talking about is celebration, because let's not forget it. Despite everything I've said about the Olympics, they are very popular and they do have a certain feel-good factor even when they're happening in your city if you're aware of these things I'm talking about. But with her, it's the tenets of neoliberalism, and what I'm talking about is these public-private partnerships that are hardly that. They're so lopsided, they should be called like public, private * partnerships, right? So it's something very different going on here. They can happen at the same time. They go hand in hand. They can be a 1-2 punch. If you think about it, you have a celebration like the Olympics or World Cup where you spent all this public money. Everybody knows about it. You can turn around and say to the public, okay, sorry, now we're going to have to do this sort of neoliberal fiscal austerity. I know we don't want to do it, but we did, we just spent all that money, and so we're going to have to. Even though the Olympics are in the billions, whereas, most big countries' GDPs are in the trillions, but it still becomes this really important ideological device, celebration capitalism through the Olympics, for justifying all sorts of neoliberal policies. And I would say a further thing against neoliberalism for a second, because I spend a lot of my time in an academic setting at Pacific University where I work and teach. And I see it at conferences where somebody, even academic or activist conferences, where somebody says, oh, it's the neoliberal this or that, and everyone starts nodding their head like, yep, I know what you're talking about. You can say almost anything after the politics of neoliberal da-da-da, and everyone goes, yay, or I know what you're talking about, even if it's not necessarily true. Second, I think sometimes it's just analytically incorrect to use the term neoliberalism, and I've tried to show you the Olympics are a good example of where it's just inaccurate as a descriptor. Second, I would argue that it's an error in terms of politics much of the time to call things neoliberal, especially when they're not. But even when they are, I wonder if we just shouldn't call them capitalist instead of neoliberal capitalist. I think neoliberalism can often be sort of an academic term that sort of encourages your brain to shut down. And we're living in this moment right now, the most propitious moment of my 48-year life, where capitalism is being challenged by everyday people in the public arena, and we ought to harness that and call it capitalism and not obfuscate or confuse by calling it neoliberal capitalism. So, I don't have to rehearse the data with you, but some of these polls that are coming out right now, like 57% of Democrats this summer said that they hold a positive view of socialism. 57% of Democrats, and only 47% think that capitalism is a positive term. And we're talking about Democrats here. I know you have we all have some issues with many Democrats, but my point is this: now is the time to be talking about capitalism. Now, the fiscal chicanery around the Olympics kind of swerves us back to Colin Kaepernick. And while I said I really admire what he's done and he's had real principle, I've also written critically. You can look at an essay I wrote or co-wrote for The Guardian that lays out this argument in full. But I'm a little cautious about getting too excited about this moment, this combination he's done with Nike. Because if you think about Nike, they are quintessential capitalists. They are not altruists, and they have benefited massively from this partnership with Kaepernick. Stock in Nike went down a little bit for a short period of time before skyrocketing to its highest level ever at $85 a share. It's added $6 billion in value to its brand in the weeks following Kaepernick, $6 billion. And that's because it's young people who are keen to Kaepernick, or at least don't think that he's wrong, that tend to purchase Nike products. It was just a savvy move on the part of Nike when they looked at their market. And you think they didn't do that ahead of time? Of course they did, right? Now, what this ad does here, and if you might have seen the actual ad as well, and in some ways it's really moving, and I'll just leave that for you to look at later. I'm not going to play it here. But I want you to think about this. He says, believe in something even if it means sacrificing everything. What this has done is it has stripped the politics out of Kaepernick's message. And to do that, I got online and I created a couple memes to share with you. One, David Duke, believe in something, same slogan, right? David Duke probably wouldn't disagree with that. I come to you from Oregon, so I had to do an obligatory Eamon Bundy, who did the takeover of national lands in Malheur County in my state of Oregon. He believed in something, even if it meant sacrificing everything. And you know who got this point is Donald Trump Jr. He actually sent this out on Instagram, right? So I think it just points to the reality that the politics are stripped out when a group like Nike gets a hold of your inspiring and amazing story, okay? All right, so pivoting back and toward a close here, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And activists around the globe are starting to face up to the challenge of the Olympic Games. And it takes specific form depending on the type of activism that's predominant. When I was in Vancouver, there was a strong First Nations impulse there. One of the main slogans became "No Olympics on Stolen Native Land," because the land around Vancouver is Coast Salish land that had never been ceded through treaty. This is a group called the Native Warrior Society that climbed the flagpole at City Hall in Vancouver, and they made off with the Olympic flag behind them, and they're standing in front of it there. Pretty remarkable action. In London, there's a huge environmental justice community, and they spoke out and created this campaign against greenwashing there. They actually held an event in Trafalgar Square where they gave out the gold, silver, and bronze in greenwashing. They splashed green custard all over each other. Actually, just a side note, 7 of them, including those 3 right there, were arrested for their efforts for littering at Trafalgar Square. And charges were eventually dropped, but only after the Olympics had passed, and part of their bail conditions were to not go around any Olympic venues, so it basically demobilized a bunch of activists who were going to protest the games. But with the Sochi Olympics, because of the crackdown on dissent around Russia, a lot of the protests happened around the world. These photos were from New York City. This was some Circassian activists who I came to know. They live in New Jersey, but the Circassian people lived on the very same land where the Sochi Olympics happened in Russia, and they were victims of what historians of the period called genocide 150 years before those Olympics, and they used the opportunity to get the word out. Pussy Riot actually did protest during the Olympics, and this dude over here on the right was not part of the act. He was a Cossack who went in, he was part of the security force, and he horsewhipped them in front of the entire world, just highlighting the fact that there is definite price to pay for protesting in Russia.
He was voluntarily went in on his own?
He was there to keep the peace, if you will, right? And whether he had authority to do that or not, he did it. In Rio de Janeiro, Olympics for whom, that asks, and there was a strong group of students that were involved in that, including some right there in the front row who I came to know in my time there. A really strong base with the Comité Popular da Copa do Mundo y das Olimpíadas, the Popular Committee of the World Cup and the Olympics, which was started around the World Cup of 2014, and it was in all these cities that coalesced in Rio. There was strong favela activism because 77,000 people were displaced for the Olympics. This was some graffiti on the wall of Vila Autódromo that I showed you before. Olimpiada is the Olympics, but piada in the parentheses is joke. So there's like all sorts of creative stuff being done. There have been some activists who've been speaking out. This is Alexei Sobolev, the Russian snowboarder, who at the 2014 Sochi Olympics, when he got down to the end of his run, had a very much of a likeness of Pussy Riot on his board. And when he was asked about it afterwards, was that a shout out to Pussy Riot? He was like, well, maybe, let you think what you want about it. And there's also activists like Lawrence Halstead. This is a guy I've been working with who's a 2-time Olympian from Team GB in fencing, who's been very outspoken around environmental issues. And he also encourages athletes to speak out. Now he's helping train up younger aspiring Olympians in Summer Olympic sports. But let's not forget that the Olympics are a machine driven by overlapping groups of elites. On the left is Thomas Bach, the president of the International Olympic Committee, the current president. You know that guy on the right. The Olympics and who runs it is a privileged sliver of the global 1%. They hold great advantages. But as the brilliant thinker Stuart Hall has written, hegemony is never forever. Sports can bring vital social issues into focus. More and more people are facing the complexity of the Olympics, of capitalism, and using it as a springboard for effective activism. And so with that, I look forward to your thoughts, and I thank you for your attention.
So we have about 55 minutes, it looks like, for discussion, so a good block of time. So we're going to open it up. If you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand, and Jules will take 3 questions at a time, answer them, and then we will keep going. So would anyone like to start off?
Hello, thank you for your talk. I have a question when it comes to dealing with the BDS movement and sports, especially when it comes to World Cup or the Olympics. Where I come from, in Egypt, there's always, every single Olympics, there's this debate about Egyptian players facing Israeli players and whether or not they should do that for boycott, divestment, and sanctions reasons. And of course comes the problem of like national representation in these Olympics and whether or not this individual action should be taken as a part of the larger BDS movement, even though it's not directly related to it. And yeah, just your thoughts about potentially incorporating the Olympics within the larger BDS scheme, just like it happened with apartheid South Africa.
Thank you.
And one over there.
Thank you so much for this talk. Really appreciate it. I remember when the Beijing 2008, I think it was, Olympics were going on, and I don't know if it was just kind of me growing up and starting to become aware of these things, but it felt like that was kind of a turning point in terms of how much money was being spent, how much infrastructure, and I was wondering if you could talk about that Olympics in particular, and the effects that workers felt and the conditions of workers as these Olympic Games go around the world, and the pressures to, the working conditions, how intense it can be.
Yeah.
And I had over there.
Yes, thank you so much for that. That was instructive and very entertaining and engaging. So I had a question that you brought up a thought when you mentioned that Obama had done the raising of the fist. I didn't know that, but it led me to think about how sad it is that it's from him co-opting in a way this very dramatic action that these people took in '68, that a lot of people would have found out about it because it's not widespread knowledge that people know about that action, or the fact that other actions have been taken on behalf of athletes in terms of protesting, demonstrating against this, capitalist enterprise that takes away so many of the resources. So it leads me to think about how important it is, the work that you do, but in a way also how important it is to spread this information, to really talk about it. Most of us know people who love sports. Majority, I think, people love sports in one way or another, or have seen the Olympics or have experienced it somehow. But how many people really understand the impact that it has? How many people understand how aggressive it is in the ways that it attacks in all of those categories that you explained? So it's just a comment, not really a question, but it was something that really sparked my attention and an intense feeling of disgust, like, somebody should be talking about this besides Obama.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. All really interesting questions and comments. Let's just take them one by one. The BDS, I see it as a real opportunity with the Olympics because if, living in the United States, as I imagine most of us in this room do, it's sometimes you live in this swirl of pro-Israel that obviously doesn't pertain to the rest of the world. And the Olympics are this obviously international and global event where there are athletes from Egypt and elsewhere who are extremely sympathetic to the Palestinian people. So it seems to me that if you could parlay your efforts with an athlete, this could raise the profile. It's complicated in the case of Egypt. We just saw this with the 2018 World Cup this summer, and we saw, speaking of co-optation, the co-optation of your beloved Mohamed Salah of Egypt and plays for Liverpool of club soccer, brilliant football soccer player who showed up, and it appeared like he was basically yanked out of bed by a war criminal in Chechnya and pulled out, and you still look bleary-eyed in the photos. It was propped up next to Kadyrov and like for photo ops. And so you have to be extremely careful as an athlete, as you were mentioning, and to figure out what to get involved with and not. And I'm afraid to a certain degree that what happened with Salah could turn off a lot of athletes that aren't able to keep up because they're working full-time on their sport. But in terms of, so in a way, thinking about what I've been talking about, you've got the athletes who we should always be open to trying to talk to whenever they're willing to talk to us. But then there's the activist groups, and I think that with the Olympics, that's a really potentially fruitful ground for raising the profile of issues around boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Beijing was a human rights nightmare. I mentioned the 1.5 million people who were displaced to make way for venues and so on. And I'm glad you brought up the working conditions, because I don't think I properly highlighted how horrific they were for workers stuffed into these tiny rooms to create these different venues. Not to mention all the volunteer labor that goes into the Olympics, Beijing and otherwise. I mean, there was a lot of transnational housing rights activism done around Beijing because so many people had been displaced. A group in Switzerland kind of led the way on that. Again, what you'll see with some of these Olympics like Beijing, Sochi, or any Olympics really, is activists or housing advocates doing something called piggybacking. Piggybacking meaning piggybacking off of the Olympics or the World Cup and hijacking them for your own political purposes, piggybacking. So like that was done, I think, fairly effectively in Beijing, but what's kind of a kick in the gut is that despite all the great work that was done, and despite the fact that it was so obvious what was happening in Beijing and how people were treated so shabbily, being displaced and treated terrible as workers, the International Olympic Committee still turned around and awarded them the 2022 Olympics, being the first city to host both the Summer and Winter Games. And what that points to in terms of like organizing against the Olympics is that these people are, as I said, a privileged to live above the global 1%, and they are not going to listen to us. So like, you can attack, and we should attack, on the issue of safety of people in the city, being displacement, work through athletes as well. But it seems to me one of the key areas, if we really want to stop all this malfeasance around the Olympics, is to do what activists have done around the globe and just say no when it tries to come to your city. Protest early and often when it comes to your city. And that's just difficult to do in Beijing. It was difficult to do in Sochi as well. So I think we should all keep an eye on Beijing going forward, because that's where the 2 Olympics down the road will happen. The next one's in Tokyo in 2020. I didn't even talk about them, but there's a whole lot of problems there as well. But I think your question highlights that it's not just about money either, because we don't even really know how much was spent at Beijing. It's a little bit of a black box there in terms of their overall budget. We've seen anywhere between 30 to 41 billion that was spent there. I mean, that's a pretty big range, right? So I think, and the point about labor also is that there's a huge volunteer labor force for each Olympic Games that we don't often hear about. So the Olympics are producing this huge amount of money for corporate sponsors, an opportunity for them to wine and dine potential clients and so on. And then it relies on the backs of volunteer labor, tens of thousands of volunteers. Well, guess who gets to volunteer? When I was in Rio, I was watching the process very carefully about who volunteered to participate as volunteers at the Olympics, and it was, of course, people that had money, because you're not getting paid. It can take like a month off your life to get trained up and then stay in Rio. It might be fun, but it's a luxury if you're a working person to take a month off. A factor we were reminded of yesterday in the presentation about France and the rail strikes there, right? It's like you can't just it's very difficult to ask someone to do that. So there's a lot that's rolled into Beijing, and I think there's a lot that's rolled into your question that we can look to moving forward. And just the last point, the comment with Obama and co-optation, I don't think I properly highlighted how these guys' lives were affected by the Olympics. When I say these guys, I mean Tommy Smith and John Carlos. they're being celebrated now, and as I mentioned, on Wednesday, there'll be this big celebration where they participated in track and field at San Jose State University. But when they got back, their lives were very difficult. I've done archival work in the archives of the International Olympic Committee and the letters that were sent to our friend Slavery Avery Brundage, some of them chastising him for kicking them out of the Olympic Village, others saying, well done, these people are scum of the earth, and so on. And the supposed scum of the earth, I think they're incredibly courageous guys, obviously, but the supposed scum of the earth had a very difficult time getting work, and you can trace that out through their autobiographies. They had attacks by the U.S. government. John Carlos has written about how he feels like it was the U.S. government was surveilling his actions. He would get, one of the stories is that he got, so these guys were basically running around the country trying to make a little bit of money giving public talks and stuff, and they would speak at colleges and universities where the people were a little more open-minded to hearing from them. And then afterwards, they'd pose for photos, arms around people. These photos would get sent to Carlos afterwards with arrows written on them saying, John Carlos, written to his wife, John Carlos's wife, saying, slept with that one, and really tried to get in her head and mess with her psychologically. And unfortunately, she ended up dying by suicide. And I'm not saying it was simply because of the efforts to paint this picture. What I am saying is that there were real prices that these guys paid that I hope become part of the conversation still in the coming week. And maybe it's interesting for us to keep an eye on that. And then last point, I'm with you. I think more people. It's a topic where you can talk to more people. I was having an interesting conversation yesterday with a participant here, where we were talking about, it was his cousin actually, it's my uncle. My uncles, I love them, but they're right-wing guys from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and they don't want to talk. For more than a decade of my life, I wrote about state repression, and whenever I'd come back for Thanksgiving and try to get that conversation rolling with Uncle Mike about state repression, wasn't happening, all right? But you can talk to them about the Green Bay Packers and the fact that the Green Bay Packers are the one community-owned team in the National Football League, and that's why they're not moving from Green Bay anytime soon, because the owners, the people who live there, who own it in theory, they're not moving it. So he'll talk about that, and you can talk to fiscal conservatives. My uncles are fiscal conservatives as well, and you can talk to them about these huge prices that they're paying through their taxes as workers for these Olympics, and they're right on board with you, as we saw with Denver 76. So that's a point I'm glad to try to emphasize a little bit, and that I mentioned early, that even if you're not a huge sports fan, and I appreciate you staying all the way through and not dashing out, I would just consider thinking targeted knowledge about the sports world that you can turn and convert to your cousin or your uncle or whomever to have the conversations that I think are vital for our particular political moment.
So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, and then we'll go 4, 5, 6. Okay.
I want to say thank you as well. I wanted to bring 2 points up. The fact that the popularity of activism can wash out, like the example that you gave with the memes. This idea of, can you talk a little bit more about that? Like activism being popular, therefore it can be sold. And I want us to know a little bit about your thoughts of the way that athletes get educated, sort of get sponsors, and they can pay a lot of money and not actually get educated through their colleges, and what your thoughts are about that exactly, to not educate these people so that one day when they become popular, they're not speaking out, they're not educated about what's going on in the world and whatnot. So I want to hear your thoughts about that.
So two short things. One, I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about, you mentioned this idea of sports as social reproduction and sort of what you think about that. And then my question is, I wonder, you said in the beginning it was this gap between professionals weren't allowed. And I wonder if there's another aspect to the Olympics that I'm sure you've thought about, which is, it really stands out when they have the opening ceremony and the number of athletes per different countries. So there'll be the U.S. with like as many as they can put up, and then there'll be some, I don't remember, India had like 3 people or something walking around. And so in a way it's like just to be in the Olympics means that country has a whole host of wealth and commercial profits that are organized around various different sports to even train the athletes, even the facilities and so on. And just how, in a way, even the Olympic Games are sort of, yes, it's supposed to be anyone, the best athletes in the world come to compete, when in fact it's not even close to that, because the number of athletes that just don't even get considered ever, or let alone the country that just doesn't even have the sports to begin with. And so I just wonder, what about that?
It was I had there and then. Okay, what do you next? Yeah.
So I was wondering about what sort of resistance there was in Rio, like especially in the favelas. How did they kind of resist gentrification and displacement, and especially who was organizing that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just 3, is that what you want?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Oh, wow, okay. Well, let's start. I'll just go right down the line again. So the issue of co-optation, I think anytime any activist or human being speaks out in a way that's creative in a capitalist society, we are prone to co-optation. Susan Douglas, the writer, wrote in one of her books that capitalism's strength, perhaps its greatest, is its ability to co-opt and domesticate opposition to transubstantiate criticism into a host of new marketable products. And I think she's right. And so that's a function of being within a capitalist system. So the effects, and I think this is where you were going with it a little bit, I think it's very much on point, is that the effects can be fleeting, and that we always have to continue to change our activist repertoires. But that I see that as 2 things. One, as part of this co-optation dynamic within a capitalist system, and second, as part of a larger dialectic of resistance and restriction on the part of governments, on the part of police states who might like to restrict activism, and then we adjust our activist repertoires. There's just perpetual back and forth going on there as well. Inevitable, but it presents itself the new challenge of always trying to stay fresh with your approach. In terms of your second point about athletes and education, there's a few different ways of thinking about this. I think it's gotten a lot of play because of the NCAA and athletes that push through the system and don't get the education that they deserve because they're basically have a full-time plus job in their sport. And I very much do place it on the system more than I do on the athletes. But within the Olympics education field, a lot of people drop out. We see it with gymnastics, for example. We're seeing it more and more with soccer, where if you want to become an elite Olympic athlete in those sports, you kind of have to dedicate yourself quite young, especially gymnastics. They've developed these academies in different places, like the one in Florida for a long time was in Bradenton, Florida, for soccer players. And I long wanted to infiltrate them, if you will, or get a job there basically as like the history teacher or something. I thought, boy, you could really teach a lot of people that are young enough to still be open-minded and present them with a lot of ideas. I never did quite get to pull that off, unfortunately. But it also points up the difference between somebody like Samantha Ratrossi and LeBron James. Everybody knows who LeBron James is, right? Because he's an NBA superstar and Olympian and all that. Olympian's like the smallest thing on his resume, right? But then there's Samantha Ratrossi, who we might not be as familiar with. She was a participant in the 2006 Olympics in Turin as a luge athlete, and she was totally reliant on corporate sponsors, which I think was part of what you were getting at with like the sponsorship element with some of these smaller sports. it can really impinge on your ability to speak out. She couldn't have gone to the Olympics were it not for Verizon backing her. So what's she going to do? Like start speaking out about the perils of corporate power in the United States? We can hardly blame her if she's not going to, because she's not probably going to keep that sponsorship and she's not going to go to the Olympics. Now, she had a terrible outcome at the Olympics, side note. She went down to the bottom of the hill in her luge. You know, they go like 1,000,000 miles an hour in those things down those ice chutes, and smashed it at the end, and like her body was like a bag of bones. She's okay now. She survived it, but it was a brutal, brutal end to her Olympics. And she didn't have a huge cushion like LeBron James does to say whatever he wishes. Now, what I don't want you to hear me saying is that I'm not keen to what LeBron James is doing. I think LeBron James, and we can maybe talk about this later, has really shifted the terrain of athlete activism and really opened it up and created cover for people, even like Samantha Ratrasi, who's hinged in, really shifted the turf, and he deserves a lot of credit for it. But in terms of the sports as social reproduction, there's a lot of ways of looking at it. I was thinking it more in terms of capitalist reproduction, but I think you can even get down to the sort of micro level of how we become trained up as humans. The obvious competitive element of sports and how you're just supposed to do it to win, win, win. Probably most people in this room that played a sport at one time had that told to them, where you really got to win, even if you're playing just like for recreational sports. Historical side note was that those worker games that I highlighted very briefly, that was not the ethos. So it points to like a totally different version of social reproduction through sport that is entirely possible. Those Olympics had hundreds of thousands of participants. I had said that right, hundreds of thousands. They had different levels. Like if you wanted to be an elite athlete, there was a category for that. There was sort of medium comparative, like medium competition range. And then those that are just purely doing it for fun, right? And so there are other ways of organizing sports. The way they're organized now very much mirror some of the same incentives within the capitalist system. And then your point is right about, especially not just participation in these Olympics, but who medals in the Olympics very much reproduces the differences in the global north and south. There are particular sports where that doesn't hold, like sprinting for Jamaica, for example. But in general, when you look at the medal tables, it's who are the economic powers and who has the money to plunge into these sort of sporting events. So the Olympics are a good example of the reproduction of economic power around the world. And we shouldn't forget that, even as the Olympics have done some things like create a refugee team, which is pretty interesting, of a small group of refugees who is too dangerous to train in their home countries. The International Olympic Committee pays for them to be trained at a neutral site in their sport, and they participate. No one won a medal who was a refugee. So you could be saying, they're just kind of co-opting, the situation of refugees to try to get a little bit of positive sheen on the Olympics. I think that'd be a fair critique if you were thinking that. But the larger point is that, yes, the inequalities of global capitalism express themselves through the Olympics in pretty clear ways. In terms of that last question about favela resistance, I gave you a couple of photographs of Vila Autódromo, and one thing that was amazing about Vila Autódromo was you asked who was the main organizing people there. It was women. Women were out front in Rio, big time. And there were actually some scrawlings in graffiti on the walls that I took photos of that celebrated that fact. Women like Eloisa Elena Costa-Bertu, I showed you the photo of her, a candomblé practitioner, but there were many others who were in the lead in Vila Autódromo. And what did they do? They refused to move. So there was kind of these buyout packages that were offered to people, oftentimes far lower than what their houses were actually worth. And they were pressured to take them. But some people refused to take them. And so as you could see the photographs of Vila Autódromo being smashed bit by the people that did take the buyouts, there were some holdouts. And they held out to the very end, and what they won was a promise from then Mayor of Rio, Eduardo Paes, to rebuild homes for them, the ones that refused to move, just to the side of where they were living in Vila Autódromo. And so they built these 20 homes, cookie cut, exactly the same, every last one of them. And if you went to that favela before, or any favela really in Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo, you'll see like this beautiful creativity in how they're built. They're never like the exact same. I mean, it's like always slightly different depending on the materials at hand, the amount of money that you have to spend. It was these cookie cut, 20 of them in a row, and a street that went right down. And I actually went to a celebration of that because it was an activist victory. I don't want to minimize it just because it was like cookie cut homes. They were all saying to me then when I was talking to them, oh, wait till the Olympics are over and everyone forgets about Rio, everyone like on the global media, we're going to fix up these exactly how we want them, right? But for the time, they looked cookie cut. We had a big celebration. Actually, that was an interesting moment for me because we were there to celebrate the resilience of these people in this community. And partway through, some of the younger people who were there, I'm talking like 15, 16, 14, they want to do something. And Vila Autódromo was quarter mile from that green space, quote unquote, that I showed you where all the Olympic stadia were. And they basically said, let's get these signs and let's go march. And I was like, okay. So we marched over to the Olympic stadia and we stood right in front of them. I mean, basically violating the Olympic charter, as we stood there. Remember, I put that element of it up there where it's illegal to have any kind of political protests. And we stood there, the cops stayed away from us. We had numerous people come by. We were chanting and yelling and doing our slogans and stuff. And nobody said anything negative to us. We had all sorts of positive comments. We had people come and share their stories of displacement, and heart-wrenching stories. So the community was led by young people. The community was led by women. There were men as well. But that's just one favela that was steamrolled for the Olympics. As I say, 77,000 people were displaced for the Rio Olympics, and that's conservative. I'm going with the city's own numbers, the city of Rio de Janeiro. So it was creative as well, and largely women-led.
Right there, and right there.
Hello. One aspect that surprises me that was left is in Mexico City in '68, the most important thing that happened over there were the student revolts before and during and after, and people were killed, during the Olympics, and it was a whole series of protests by the people of the city of Mexico that were tired of a corrupt regime, and the Olympics were there trying to, divert attention from all the social problems that were happening in the Republic of Mexico. The Mexico '68 and the activism and the popular movement should have been mentioned. I mean, as something that was worldwide recognized. It was a heroic blood that was shed before and after the Olympics. And actually, the CIA, the American CIA, during this process, sent equipment to the Mexican, repressive forces, and that's been documented by even bourgeois publications in retrospect, like the New York Times and so on. And the Olympics have always been, in many times a forum for stimulate national rivalries, anti-communism. As for example, the 1980 Olympics was boycotted by none other than the so-called President of Peace, Jimmy Carter, because of the invasion of the so-called Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. And actually, while he was arming, training, and financing the crazy, sexist criminals of the Mujahideen, that was going on. And this fucking country boycotted the 1980 Olympics because of that. They were militarily being involved. So, this boycott had a political and an economic purpose. And you talk about the Los Angeles Olympics. Yes, of course. But those Olympics were also boycotted by the Soviet Union and the Eastern European bloc. And actually, in some senses, that the 1984 Olympics were a fucking joke. Because, as for example, the Cuban Olympic team, the boxing team, is the best. and they were not there. And the many Eastern European countries that had good things were not there. And this was a response to the United States, political motivated boycott that happened, during those years. So, the Olympics is a platform for nationalism, to stimulate also national rivalries and racial, stereotypes. There are sports that are played by millionaires and by petty bourgeois and bourgeois, like boating and all these sports that poor people don't have the resources. So, I like sports, let me say. And, I grew up playing sports. But I got to tell you one thing. I call to the people of the world to boycott the freaking Olympics. That's a capitalist corporate spectacle. And, let's play physical activity and our own sports, and the hell with the, regular Olympics.
Actually made a mistake. We probably got to wrap up at 45. So if we can take a couple of keep the answers maybe a little shorter. And I want to get maybe a couple more on the left side. Okay, yeah.
Once again, thank you very much for your talk. I found it really, really interesting. I really welcome your piece that you said about neoliberalism and just that being a label that people throw out as a way to say, oh, this is not really capitalism, it's just really bad, right now. And, I think, no, it's capitalism. And it's the way that we see sports today, it's how it's being distorted by the system, the social society that we live in. And I was going to ask you more about the Workers' Olympics in the 20s in Europe, which I thought was interesting as well. But I wanted to challenge you a little bit to dream. I'm curious, I know it's maybe a topic for a whole nother talk, but how would you start off a talk maybe? Just a couple words on what would sports look like under a socialist society where you have no borders, no wars, and no jails and prisons, and where it really can be this sort of a testament to the internationalism that people really do enjoy, I think, about the Olympics. It's, different cultures coming together in a way. Thanks.
So thank you for the talk. It was really amazing. So actually, two of the points that I wanted to make are already touched upon. You mentioned that, despite all these protests and whatnot, the Olympics are highly popular. Could it have to do with the nationalism they foster? And sports, rivalry. You mentioned this French baron from the get-go who invented the thing, right? Very militaristic, very nationalistic kind of thing. Maybe it is still going on. And the second thing is actually the flip side of the coin. So I was working with immigrant communities in Turkey, Syrians and Pakistanis, over the summer. And what would they do is they would have like kids soccer teams, mixed soccer teams, like Turkish and Syrian kids playing in the same thing against, another team also mixed to, foster that kind of, I don't want to say internationalism, that's too broad maybe, but like at least overcome the racism, as well as like Pakistani and Indian migrants together in the same team playing hockey against another mixed team. Again, to overcome that, Indian-Pakistani conflict reproduced in another, part of the world, because they're both migrants in Turkey. My question would be, how can we make it larger to encompass really an internationalist perspective? Or is it even possible and feasible? Thank you.
Okay, I've been told to be quicker with my responses. And I will. So, Tlatelolco massacre, absolutely. I'm with you. Really important for understanding what happened in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. And if you're interested in pursuing what the gentleman was talking about with the CIA involvement, I'd recommend going to the National Security Archive, where they've put a lot of the documents around CIA involvement that have been declassified. I think it's really interesting. I do write about it in my book. I have a short amount of time, so I try to have to pick and choose a little. The question of socialist sport. I love that question, and I think it really behooves all of us to think about that question, what it would look like. But I think we've seen hints of it in some of the comments that people have made here today. One is a more internationalist flavor, not parceled out by nation, because that is definitely, as has been noted, nationalism is a key element of the Olympics, and it stokes unhealthy rivalries in many ways. So how could we create different ways of organizing teams, whether it's, you put countries who are responsible, this wouldn't work really, but countries that are responsible for climate change emissions, start a few meters behind, or, stuff like that could be fun, and it would sort of decrease the competition. And for those that want the hyper competition, there'd be space for that, for those that are serious training. But I think those socialist Olympics in the 1920s and 1930s really point the way for us. Have parties, have parades where everybody gets to go in. You don't have to have a special VIP pass like you do nowadays to go to the Olympics. Everybody participates. There's music festivals. There's international elements to the music festivals. That's how I can see, socialism and sport coming together. I don't think you're ever going to get rid of the competitive element, nor do I necessarily think we should. I think that's some people really gain a lot out of excelling in that particular way, but don't have it be the entire event. I think that those would be some of the initial steps that I would take on the road.
So we got time for about one more batch of questions. I made a mistake. I thought we were going till 4, but the next talk actually is going to start at 4. So we're going to take one more batch of questions. I want to kind of prioritize maybe the left side, but if any last questions, we can take a bunch and have Jules finish off for us. So last batch. So I'll do there, and there. That'll be the last 3.
Which one did you find?
It's here in the front.
Her?
Yeah.
Can you get her? She's been raising her hand.
Okay, so we'll do those last 4. So right there. Perfect.
Hi, I'm curious if anything we just discussed also applies to the Paralympics.
To the what?
To the Paralympics?
Yes.
To me? I was going to talk about all the things that I used to do when I was 10 and 12. And I used to we lived with other children on the block, and so we played baseball and football and racing and acrobatics and all the things that I was alienated from when I went to high school, and it became that it wasn't really acceptable for girls or people to be physically active like that. But I want to tell you about the baseball that we played. The baseball was children all the way from this size to this size, and everybody was urged to do their best, and we always fought to do the best, and then one team would win, and then the next day a different team would win, and they'd be composed of a different composition of the children. And the winning didn't get anything, but you had a great time out there arguing for, by the competition, arguing for doing your best. One of the people was a spastic, I guess I could call him, and my mother met his mother years later, and his mother was practically down on her knees talking about how wonderful it was. Everybody was treated the same. We used to run for him because he couldn't run. He pitched. So the attitude there, you're talking about your socialist. I mean, this is a conversation that people can have when they're talking to somebody else, is we don't have to have. The competition for profit is everywhere, about everything. And it's also, by regulation, whatever, it's also for sports. And it needn't be. None of this that needs to be, other than us feeding each other and housing each other and so forth. And the same about sports. You get out there and have a fantastic time. We're going to win today, or we're going to win now, or I'm going to catch that guy out in left when I'm in left field.
So right here, and then he's going to close us out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just had a quick thought that when we're talking to people who haven't thought about these issues and who love the Olympics and have that feel-good attitude toward them, that sometimes there are so many issues that are wrong with it that maybe focusing on one like displacement, I think, is something that everybody can understand. That we all know about people who being displaced by eminent domain for a highway or high-speed rail or whatever, and people get pretty exercised about that. More so when people are displaced just because the municipality wants higher taxed shopping mall or something going in where they live. But the idea of people being displaced for a once-off event from their homes is something I think that a pretty wide range of people could get exercised about.
You don't need that. I'll cut it all down to one. It's sort of the celebrity protesters also. So I noticed, and I think one overlooked figure in '68 was Peter Norman. So I wish you would just comment on that, because today that picture again is on the front page or the green page in the Chronicle, because Harry Edwards' event down there. So we have, but just sort of, I think it's just sort of emblematic of things too that we also see in the various movements that are made up of masses of people, many of them invisible, and sort of there are consequences, but people also stand there.
Okay, thank you. Start with the Paralympics. A lot of the dynamics apply. Paralympics are basically tacked on to the Olympic host. Usually there's a little gap, a week or two between them. And they tend to get much less media coverage. And but the same, so since they follow a lot of the dynamics I've discussed around the Olympics they apply, because they use the same venues and so on, and they cost the same for the Paralympics. One thing that's interesting about the Paralympics, and there's many things, I think that one is that in the United States it's become this place where vets can participate, injured military veterans, and it's become like a place where can exert themselves and feel good after difficult service. So there's, like all these things, whether it's the Olympics or Paralympics, they come with some positive elements, social positives and individual positives as well. But the same bigger picture macro dynamics I described definitely apply to the Paralympics, because they're essentially a tack on. In terms of like how to approach somebody, I think it depends who they are. You know, you have to read your friend, you have to read your family member. If they're going to be more affected by displacement, do that. If they're a fiscal conservative, like my uncle, that's where I always start. Or if they're like, a Packer fan, in the case with a lot of my family, you start there. And then talk about ownership from there and who owns what and so on. And then Peter Norman, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Kip, because Peter Norman was the other person on the medal stand in the 1968 Olympics who was wearing an Olympic Project for Human Rights badge that was given to him by one of the Olympic athletes that he wore, and he got a lot. He just stood there. He obviously didn't put his fist up or anything. He just stood there. And when he went back to Australia, he was treated terribly, and he wasn't included in anything around the Olympics. They wouldn't let him participate in the next one, even though he had really good times. And when Sydney hosted the Olympics in 2000, they didn't have him participate at all. Okay, so he ended up having a very difficult life. He died somewhat recently, and Smith and Carlos, who did put their fists up, were some of his pallbearers. But he's a really good example, Peter Norman, about how solidarity matters, and how standing aside when you have white privilege is stepping up and acting and not being a passive observer of political processes is really important. And I guess I would just conclude, I appreciate you sharing your experiences growing up and how sport can be a place where everyone can be a part. And I think as we move forward with the socialism of the future, I think that's going to come a lot sooner than getting rid of competition. So I think we should just kind of keep that positive, humanistic spirit that you've articulated at the center. So thanks, everybody.